This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week's guest is writer Nancy Campbell, author of 50 Words for Snow and The Library of Ice, Readings in a Cold Climate. Her latest book, Thunderstone, a true story of losing one home and discovering another, is a memoir telling the story of the end of her relationship with her partner Anna and moving to live off-grid in an old caravan. Despite the transitory nature of Nancy's existence the summer she wrote the book, nature and gardening feature as constants, and she manages to connect with plants and her environment wherever she travels. I started by asking Nancy how the book came about.
The book emerged out of a time of crisis, really. After lockdown ended, I'd been caring for my ex-partner who had suffered a severe stroke, and we'd agreed to live together for a year and I would care for her, and then after that year I would move on. And I wasn't quite sure where I would move on to, but a friend suggested I lived in the woods in a caravan for a while just to regain my equilibrium, really, and my sense of self, which gets quite eroded, as anyone who's been a carer will know. So I was in nature, which I love, and meeting new people after lockdown, which was extraordinary, that sort of rush of social activity again. And I was keeping a journal, as I often do, and just making notes about the woods around me, the growth of things. I moved into the caravan in the spring, so there was this real sense of burgeoning nature, the greenery of the woods, leaves coming back, a real sense of restoration. I was writing the journal for myself. It was very important for me to sort of piece together my feelings about the world. And slowly I began to feel that it might be a document that I might share. So really the book is quite a personal document and full of all sorts of things, notes about the garden that I began to grow in the woods and reflections on trees and wildlife, just a real mixed bag like anyone's journal is.
Reading the book, obviously you have the people, you have events that kind of take centre stage, you've got the backdrop of the pandemic, the caravan is the kind of main character, but throughout the whole thing, you seem to connect back to landscapes and nature. And I thought it was really interesting because it particularly struck me how you describe places through the plants that occur there. And I would say especially so for my reading, and maybe it's because of my background, I picked up on it, but I thought you especially did that in relation to people and the plants that sort of surround their dwellings and how people cultivate plants. Is that something that you do consciously? You use the landscape to describe things?
I think that's really interesting you picked up on that. And I really relate to landscape. And I grew up in Northumberland with parents who were keen gardeners, and we were lucky to have a garden. And I found in subsequent travels and living all over the place in Europe and the UK, often not having a garden was a big frustration, but I would always grow things in any way I could. So during lockdown, I was growing hyacinths and little seedlings, pak choi seedlings in yogurt pots. So when I finally got to a greener space, the caravan was located in a kind of industrial dump area of the woodland, and I was clearing ground and was free to really build my own garden from scratch. So that was a great delight to finally have space to work the land after many years of not having access to earth. And the people around me were really keen gardeners and were full of recommendations. So I suppose our conversations often focused around plants, which are quite a safe topic if you're just getting to know people. And I was living beside the canal, so there were many people on narrow boats. And it really fascinated me how the boaters used their space, because as your listeners will know, the stretches of garden along a towpath are very, very narrow, and it just really intrigued me what people would grow, whether you grow flowers or something useful like beans. So I suppose I do characterise people by the flora in their lives. There was one boat called Pirate Princess, which was a really extraordinary long old green boat, very sort of Gothic. And it intrigued me because it had arum lilies and sort of deadly nightshade and hogweeds growing alongside the boat, which seemed very fitting for the sort of Gothic feeling of the owner had created around her home, as well as all the beautiful, beautiful gardens with nasturtiums and sweet peas.
Yeah, it was interesting. And again, I think probably because I come from a background in horticulture where there has been some formal training involved, what really struck me reading the book was how you kind of have this effortless, innate knowledge of nature. Again, not to labour the point, but I don't know whether you're unself-conscious in your description of nature, but you're always bang on. And the way that you channel your travels and, again, your descriptions through that language, it's phenomenal, actually. And it's almost like you're sort of channeling somebody from like a bygone era, somebody who's got a traveling background. It's effortless. The description of nature is effortless. Obviously, you are so connected to the land and it comes so naturally to you. And yet you always seem to be moving along and almost relatively rootless. How do you reconcile those two states of being?
I think I've always been curious about places, and growing up, my family did actually move around quite a lot. So I think I learnt not to put down my own roots and just appreciate the roots that I found in places temporarily. And yes, as you say, I've travelled quite a lot for work. My first writing assignment was working in Greenland in the most northern museum in the world in the winter, recording the stories of Inuit hunters. And I've spent a lot of time in the last decade up in the Arctic, often in winter, often with deep snow. So not really had access to knowing about the plant life in places, although I have travelled in Greenland in the summer too and seen there's crowberries. And I think somewhere like that, where there is such sparse vegetation, you really grow to appreciate the tiniest lichen. They're like friends growing out of the rock because they're so bold and brave to have survived. And so ancient as well, those really ancient plants like ferns, which fascinate me too. And I write about the ferns in the woods around me in the book. The screen that they created was a real joy to me as it grew up over the summer. I love the fact that you say that I'm knowledgeable, because I really feel that I'm not at all. I've picked up my knowledge in a really haphazard way from friends and conversations, and maybe that's why I remember it. I found during lockdown a lot of the experiences that I'd had during past travels came back to me and sort of tumbled out in my journals as if I was remembering friendships and past conversations. So maybe that is why these facts about breweries and hops and ferns and Oxford ragwort coming from Sicily and travelling up the railway tracks of the UK, maybe that's where they come from.
You mentioned obviously that you've been growing ferns, and you also mentioned, I think, that your caravan's in a fairly woodland setting. Have you found it relatively easy to garden?
What I've learnt this year over the course of it is that the garden does its own work. And this is something I'd never realised before, that I could have a plan for the garden, but the garden itself would decide what would grow. And obviously I knew about soil quality and things, but it really was a lesson that didn't go in until I saw what survived. So this summer, I'm just had a year. So I'm seeing what worked last year and what didn't. And there were things like I grew some Sicilian mint. I started a bed of mints because I wanted to grow things that would be almost not apparent to anyone walking past on the towpath. I wanted to create a very natural greenery, and also obviously a herb garden can be quite useful. So I had a Japanese mint that I'd bought from the flat I shared with my former partner, and I potted that out, and it was quite funny to see it going from being a domestic plant in a pot with a really root-bound ball and going into the soil and then sort of finding its way there. And I acquired some other mints from friends. But the Sicilian mint, the beautiful Sicilian mint that I bought at the garden centre, was just completely consumed by slugs. So I realised that there was no way that some plants were going to make it. And then the plants that do survive seem to be starting up a conversation with each other and starting fresh ideas for me about what else I might bring in. So that's quite curious. So not easy. but more like a natural process that I have to listen to, I think, and something that takes place at a very slow speed, or with sort of time travel in which you're thinking a year ahead of yourself and also looking back slightly into deep time, trying to think what might have been there in the past. So there's a lot going on, isn't there, with the garden? And quite often one isn't in control at all, I think.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. That reminds me actually about you planting some heartsease, which we spoke before we started recording about the kind of parallels that I'd had in my life to what you experienced in yours and wrote about in the book. But one of the things that made me chuckle was I started working on a site where we've been doing horticultural therapy for people with various mental health challenges. And in the first year we were here, I think I planted one viola plant and then it just colonized. It went everywhere. And it did strike me the relevance of having the heartsease here where, you know, people maybe didn't feel that easy in their hearts. This is a two-pronged question, actually, because the first part is, did you ever get the heartsease established? Because I don't think you mentioned that. And the second part of that was, it made me think about using common names for plants and what we miss when we stick to the strictly botanical Latin names. And I wondered if you thought that it was important to know the common names of plants as well.
Yes, I do believe it is. And it's just such a joy as well, isn't it? Maybe it's just because I'm a poet and I love that aspect of language, but real understanding of the history of what you're dealing with, the species that you're dealing with, this creature that you're bringing into your life. Actually, there's a passage from the book I could read about that. One of the first plants that appears in the book is yarrow, and I was actually sent some yarrow during lockdown by a friend, and it was such a balm to me to receive this tiny sprig in the post. And I think it maybe just started me thinking about where heartsease might come from and the sense that there might be a garden in my future somewhere that would help support me through some of the grief. So a friend sends me a parcel. Inside the brown paper is a little square of striped linen tied with string, and inside that, 2 heads of dried yarrow. The minuscule star-shaped flowers are light pink on one sprig, on the other dusty white. Sarah writes that she found the yarrow growing among the grass on a Neolithic tomb in Scotland. Now, on my short daily walks down to the Thames, I notice yarrow everywhere in hedges and verges. It is a plant of visions. The stalks are scattered to tell the I Ching. Applied to the eyelids, it is said to bring sixth sight. The ancient Greeks believed Chiron the centaur once taught Achilles its use as a balm for wounds. It was rumoured to originate not from pollen, but the particles of rust he scraped from his spear during the Trojan War. The botanical name, Achillea millefolium, translates as Achilles' thousand-leaf herb, but it is also known as woundwort, nosebleed plant, it starts and stops them, old man's pepper, devil's nettle, sanguinary, thousand-leaf and thousand-seal, bloodwort, herb militaris, knight's milfoil. Starlings line their nests with the leaves, and lovers should place them under their pillow to bring good fortune. And I think that's a great example of how plants have so many common names. You know, so many people know them by different names, and so many cultures have different associations. I find it endlessly fascinating, their stories.
Definitely. So did you ever get it to establish the heartsease?
I did get the heartsease established, yeah. I've got quite a beautiful barrage of it at the moment this year. I think some of the seed I was growing in quite cramped conditions within the van, so there's a stage of growing on seedlings that was quite complicated. And I do mention in the book this sort of unfortunate accident with some charred seedlings which tumbled off a shelf and onto the floor. And I'm certainly not very systematic or organised gardener, but most things seem to make it through, certainly beyond the seedling stage. And then it's just a case of discovering what really enjoys that soil and that aspect, because the woods are a little shady, but I have a wonderful sunspot where the goat willows which surround the van, there's a clearing in the canopy, and that's a lovely place for teasels and things like that. But I guess also what I never realised before this year is just how much space one needs around plants for them to spread and find their own bearing.
Especially, I guess, in your setting, because they're sort of having to tough it out and, as you say, form their own community. So it's really interesting to see that develop. So you're still in the caravan now. I may be incorrect, but I'm just guessing based on previous experiences of yours, you may not stay in the caravan forever. And it was really interesting in the book, you said that you'd kind of stumbled across trees that seemed incongruous in the woodland setting that were obviously planted there by somebody at some time. And I think your garden also has that sort of feel to it. I wonder if you've given any thought to what will happen to it if and when you leave, and if the caravan goes, will it incorporate into the woodland? Will it continue in some way?
Yes, that's a really important question, and it goes back to sort of the nature of the woods I find myself in, really. I think had I been in beautiful ancient deciduous woodland, I would have been unlikely to be doing the sort of forest garden project I'm doing now. But because it's wasteland between the canal and the railway, where a woodland has grown up since the canal was built, I suppose the land I'm on was dug out from the railway cut. So it's a sort of product of the Industrial Revolution, really. And there's a sense that the land is sort of reclaimed and almost like an ancient version of the High Line in New York, a sort of former transport route waiting to find its wild form. Now it's not used. So I felt really that it wasn't irresponsible to start introducing new species. But as I got to know the woods, I did find that there were extraordinary things, surprises, which hinted at other people before me who'd lived there. There's a ginkgo tree. There are goji berries growing along the railway cutting, and a sumac tree. And I found, when I drove my caravan in, which was quite an intrepid adventure, definitely off the track, a few days later I noticed it just by the wheel where I'd stopped. I was inches from a gooseberry bush. Really unexpected, and I was very pleased I hadn't run it over, that something had just caused me to stop there. And I'm very curious who might have planted this gooseberry. I know there were people living there on the land before me. It was a bit of a hangout for junkies and all sorts of people who, for some reason, were choosing to live in the woods rather than in houses. So there is a sense of other stories there. And I like to think that if or when I do move on, there will be a trace of me, or my thought, not me, but my thought about plants remaining. And I'm hoping that most of the plants I introduce are things that will create a lovely ecosystem that will encourage more life in the woods. So wild strawberries, things for the birds, of course, yarrow, plants that butterflies love, like verbena, and who knows what will survive. But yeah, it's nice to leave that legacy.
Definitely is. And my final question is actually something that came towards the beginning of the book. You quoted, I think it was, as you said, a peasant saying, and it is, the earth shows up those of value and those who are good for nothing. It kind of interested me, and I found it amusing and quite poignant. And I wondered if maybe you could describe what that quote means to you.
I think I feel that so much of my life is about the natural world. I'm really enthralled to nature, and I feel it teaches me so much about getting things in perspective. But more and more, the pressure is on to spend time away from the earth and to work on screen. And certainly I find for my own creative work, it's almost essential to get back to some form of, whether it's physical work or just an appreciation of nature from being in it. And I really felt a sense of value in my time, especially doing the really hardcore labour at the beginning of my project, the digging and the clearing various bits of toxic railway waste from the soil, and felt that I was giving a little bit back, and that there was value in my time in a very different way to the way there is when I'm slowly putting words on the page. It was quoted in a book by John Berger, Pig Earth, and I am a huge admirer of Berger's work and his own connection with farming in France and the importance to him of working with your hands and keeping a sense of the real world. And the other writer I quote from in the book is Thoreau, who I think had a similar sense of wanting to go back to the woods and remember what was essential about life.
Thank you very much to Nancy for writing the book and for speaking so beautifully about it too. I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I did, and thank you for taking the time to listen. Dr. Ian Bedford is up next, talking about something really clever that bugs do that I touched on in the recent Hoverflies episode.
It's often assumed that when someone copies your appearance, or another aspect of your lifestyle, that you've impressed and inspired them, since it's said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. However, we'd be wrong to assume that it's only people who imitate or mimic others, since it's also a common characteristic of many other life forms, from both the animal and the plant kingdom too. Mimicking something to attract prey, for example, such as the anglerfish, with its worm-like appendage on its head, wiggled to entice smaller fish into its mouth. Or the orchids, whose flowers mimic the appearance of the specific pollinators they have to attract. Or the vast numbers of creatures that mimic colours, shapes, and forms of plants within their habitats for the purpose of camouflage, either to hide from their predators or to stealthily ambush their prey. But there's also another form of mimicking to be seen, and that's when a relatively harmless creature evolves to look like one that's widely recognised for aggressively defending itself when threatened, hoping to fool a predator of that harmless creature to think twice before eating it. And this has been the case with the Vespidae, the yellow and black banded social wasps, renowned for their colonies that function under the highest order of organisation within the insect world, their impressive ability to solve basic problems, and their rapid and uncompromising attack response when they or their nests are threatened. An attack response that's extremely effective, using chemical signals to summon help from fellow wasps and a painful venom that's swiftly injected into attackers. And so consequently, the social wasps have very few potential predators and have even gained a respectful wariness from ourselves. So it's little wonder that the yellow and black markings of the social wasps have become a universally recognised warning sign in nature. And when those "don't mess with me" markings are mimicked by defenceless creatures such as hoverflies, they could in fact be helping to prolong their lives.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.